My name is Imogen Clark. I am 32 years old, and until recently, I worked as a systems reliability engineer for a mid sized technology company in London. Most people who met me at work would probably describe me the same way: quiet, dependable, maybe a little too calm for the chaos of the tech industry. I wasn't the loudest person in meetings. I didn't compete to dominate conversations, and I never felt the need to advertise what I was capable of. That kind of personality has an interesting side effect. People often assume you don't notice things. They assume you won't push back, that you'll quietly accept whatever responsibility lands on your desk, that you're safe to overlook. For years, that assumption worked in everyone else's favor. If a system crashed at 2 a.m., I was the one who fixed it. If a deployment went wrong, I stayed late to repair it. If someone needed just a quick favor, it somehow found its way to me. I didn't complain, not because I enjoyed it, but because I believed reliability mattered more than recognition. And in many ways, that belief defined how people treated me. But the story I'm about to tell isn't really about office politics. It's about something much stranger. It started during what should have been one of the happiest weeks of my life: my honeymoon. My husband Daniel and I had flown to Italy, a place we dreamed about visiting for years. For the first time in a long time, my laptop was turned off. My work phone was buried at the bottom of my suitcase. The only schedule we had was deciding whether to explore another tiny street in Florence or sit in a cafe for another hour. For a few days, the world felt wonderfully small. Then, halfway through the trip, my phone began to vibrate. At first, I ignored it. But when I finally checked the messages, they weren't the kind you expect to receive while watching the sun set over the Arno River. They were confused, then irritated, then angry. Coworkers were asking why I wasn't responding. Why hadn't I logged in? Why I had supposedly volunteered to cover overnight server maintenance and then disappeared. Except there was one problem. I had never volunteered for anything. And according to the company schedule that someone had quietly signed my name onto, I was supposed to be working the night shift while I was on my honeymoon in another country. At first, I assumed it was a mistake, a clerical error, a misunderstanding. But as more messages arrived, one detail became impossible to ignore. Someone hadn't just made a scheduling error. Someone had signed me up deliberately, without asking, without telling me, without expecting I'd ever notice until it was too late. And what they didn't realize was this: the quiet person they thought they understood was paying far more attention than they imagined. Before we go further, I want to ask you something. Have you ever been underestimated so completely that people forgot you were even paying attention? If you had walked into our office on a normal Tuesday morning, you probably wouldn't have noticed me. That isn't false modesty. It's just an honest description of how the room worked. The louder personalities naturally drew attention first. Sales teams debating projections, product managers presenting roadmaps, engineers arguing over architectural decisions. The office had the constant hum of a place that believed speed was proof of intelligence. And in that environment, the people who spoke the most tended to become the people everyone remembered. I wasn't one of them. My desk sat near the back of the engineering floor, close enough to the monitoring screens that I could see system alerts before most people even realized something was wrong. I liked that position. It gave me a quiet vantage point. From there, I could watch the patterns. Who asked for help only when things were already broken? Who quietly fixed problems before anyone noticed? Who took credit? Who avoided responsibility? You learn a lot about an organization by paying attention to those patterns. Most people at work knew me for one specific thing: reliability. If a server cluster started behaving strangely at midnight, my name was usually the one someone suggested in the Slack channel. Imogen will know what's going on. If a deployment created unexpected latency spikes, someone inevitably tagged me. Can you take a quick look? The phrase quick look was almost always optimistic. Sometimes it meant hours of tracing logs through layers of infrastructure until the real cause finally appeared like a thread hidden in a tangled knot. But I rarely complained about that. Solving problems was the part of the job I actually loved. What people didn't always notice was that reliability can quietly turn into expectation. At first, colleagues thank you, then they assume you'll help again. Eventually, they stop asking. They just expect you to be there. That shift doesn't happen overnight. It happens in dozens of tiny moments that barely seem important at the time. A meeting where someone assigns you an extra task without really looking it up. A late night message that starts with, "Sorry to bother you," but clearly expects an answer. A project where your work supports everyone else's success, but your name somehow disappears from the final presentation. None of those moments is dramatic. Individually, they barely register, but together, they create a quiet identity. At some point, without anyone officially deciding it, I became something very specific inside that company. The person who could always be relied on. Reliable people are valuable, but they are also convenient. Convenient people rarely cause friction. Convenient people rarely say no, and convenient people are often the easiest ones to assign something difficult when nobody else wants it. The strange thing is, I didn't resent that role at first. I understood the logic. If you're capable, work tends to find you. That seemed fair. What I didn't realize was how easily that reputation could be used without my knowledge. Because the truth is, inside most companies, there are two kinds of visibility: the kind that comes from speaking loudly, and the kind that comes from quietly carrying responsibility. I had chosen the second, and most of the time, I was perfectly comfortable there. Until the day someone decided to use that quiet reliability in a way that assumed something very specific about me. They assumed I wouldn't question it. They assumed I wouldn't notice. And most importantly, they assumed I wouldn't do anything about it. At the time, of course, none of us realized that the moment those assumptions were made, the entire story had already started. Looking back now, the first moment that should have caught my attention didn't feel important at all. It happened about 6 months before my honeymoon. We were in a weekly infrastructure meeting, one of those routine updates where each team briefly reported on system stability, upcoming deployments, and anything that might affect uptime. Nothing dramatic, just a room full of laptops, quiet typing, and occasional charts on a projector. I remember sitting near the end of the table, reviewing overnight monitoring logs while half listening to the conversation. Our manager Graham was leading the meeting that day. Graham had the kind of management style that many companies reward: efficient, decisive, a little impatient with details that slowed things down. He liked solutions more than explanations. And usually, that worked fine. At one point, the discussion turned to an upcoming server maintenance cycle. It involved a series of overnight updates that had to be carefully monitored. Nothing unusual, just the kind of work that happens quietly when most customers are asleep. Graham scrolled through the schedule on the projector. Then he paused. "We'll need someone to oversee the overnight windows," he said, "just in case anything goes sideways." There was a brief silence in the room. Not uncomfortable, just the natural pause that happens when everyone silently hopes someone else will volunteer. Graham's eyes moved across the table. Then he said it. "Imogen's probably the best person for that." He didn't ask. He said it the way someone might comment on the weather. A few heads nodded automatically. No one looked surprised. In fact, someone near the other end of the table even added, "Yeah, she's handled those before." That was technically true. But the thing about technically true statements is that they can easily slide into assumptions. I glanced up from my laptop. "Which dates?" I asked calmly. Graham clicked through the schedule. "Still finalizing the exact windows," he said, "but it's spread across a few weeks." He moved on almost immediately to the next topic. The meeting continued, and on the surface, nothing about that exchange seemed particularly unusual. No one had raised their voice. No one had argued. But something about it stayed with me, not because of the work itself. Overnight maintenance didn't bother me. It was part of the job. What stayed with me was how easily the decision had been made without me actually agreeing to it. It had happened in seconds. A statement, a few nods. Then the conversation moved on. If I had pushed back right there, it probably would have been resolved immediately. But I didn't. Partly because the schedule wasn't finalized yet. Partly because I didn't want to slow the meeting down. And partly because moments like that were so normal in our office culture that objecting felt strangely disproportionate. So I made a quiet mental note. And like I often did, I wrote a small entry in my notebook after the meeting. Not a complaint. Just a simple line with a timestamp. Maintenance schedule assigned verbally. No confirmation requested. At the time, it felt like nothing more than good personal documentation. A habit. But habits like that have a way of becoming useful later. Because what I didn't know yet was that this tiny moment, the one everyone else had already forgotten, was the first small cut in a much longer pattern. And patterns, once they begin forming, tend to repeat themselves. After that meeting, nothing dramatic happened. There was no confrontation, no follow-up email clarifying the schedule, no official request asking if I was available for overnight maintenance. Life at the office simply continued, which, in many ways, is exactly how small patterns become normal. A few days later, the draft maintenance schedule appeared in our internal project tracker. I noticed it while reviewing a separate infrastructure ticket. My name was already attached to 3 overnight windows. No one had mentioned it to me directly. But again, that wasn't unusual enough to raise alarms. In our team, tasks were often assigned quickly and adjusted later if someone had a conflict. The system relied heavily on informal trust. If something didn't work, people would usually say so. so I didn't make an issue of it. Instead, I left a short comment on the ticket. Noted. Will confirm availability closer to maintenance week. It was neutral, professional, non-confrontational. The comment received a small thumbs up reaction from one of the other engineers. And that was the end of the conversation. Or at least, it seemed that way. Over the next few weeks, though, I began noticing how easily similar moments repeated themselves. Someone would say, Imogen usually handles these alerts, or she's probably already looking into it. Occasionally, a task would appear in my queue that I didn't remember accepting. None of it was malicious. That's the strange part about workplace patterns. Most of the time, they aren't created by villains. They're created by convenience. When a system works, when someone reliably solves problems, people naturally begin routing problems in that direction. And because I rarely objected, the pattern continued. There was one moment that stands out clearly in my memory. Late one afternoon, I was finishing up a stability report when a colleague named Oliver walked past my desk. Oliver was friendly, energetic, and perpetually overwhelmed by deadlines. He stopped beside my monitor. Hey, quick question, he said. Are you covering the overnight patch cycle next week? I looked up. That hasn't been finalized yet, I replied. He frowned slightly. Oh, Graham mentioned you were handling most of them. Most of them. The phrase hung in the air for a moment. Not hostile, not aggressive, just assumed. I gave a small shrug. We'll see once the schedule is confirmed. Oliver nodded, satisfied with that answer, and walked away. But after he left, I sat quietly for a moment. Because that brief exchange revealed something important. The assumption had already spread. Inside the team's collective understanding, the overnight work had gradually become my responsibility, even though no clear conversation had ever happened. And once an assumption like that settles into a workplace culture, it becomes surprisingly resilient. People repeat what they believe is already decided. Managers reinforce what appears convenient, and the person at the center of the assumption, if they remain quiet, can easily find themselves carrying a role they never explicitly accepted. Again, I didn't protest, not because I agreed, but because I was still observing. When you work in systems reliability, you learn that problems rarely appear suddenly. They build slowly beneath the surface until one moment reveals the entire structure. Human behavior is surprisingly similar. So instead of reacting immediately, I continued doing what I had always done, watching, documenting, and paying attention to how easily small decisions about my time were being made without me. At that point, though, I still believed it was manageable. Just a normal workplace pattern. Nothing that would matter in the long run. I had no idea that somewhere, quietly and without my knowledge, someone was already preparing to take that assumption one step further, far enough that it would eventually reach me, all the way in Italy. There's a moment in many workplaces when a role forms around you without anyone formally defining it. No title change, no official announcement, just a quiet consensus about who you are to everyone else. By the time autumn arrived that year, my role had become very clear. I was the person who made sure things didn't break. If something did break, I was the one who quietly fixed it. It wasn't written anywhere in the organizational chart. Officially, we were all systems engineers with roughly similar responsibilities. But unofficially, the division had become obvious. Some people built new features, some people presented updates to leadership, and some people like me, made sure the infrastructure underneath everything else kept running. The funny thing about reliability work is that when you do it well, no one sees it. Systems stay stable, deployments go smoothly. Customers never notice the near misses that were quietly prevented hours earlier. Success looks like nothing happening at all, which meant that most of my contributions existed in a kind of background layer, useful, necessary, but rarely visible. Over time, that invisibility shaped how people interacted with me. When meetings became crowded with competing ideas, I usually spoke last. When urgent problems appeared, I usually stayed the latest. When tasks needed someone dependable, my name often appeared automatically. At first, I told myself that it was simply part of being trusted, and in many ways, it was. But trust and availability can start to blur together. The moment I truly understood the role I had been assigned came during a planning session in late November. We were reviewing infrastructure coverage for the upcoming quarter, holidays, major updates, and routine maintenance windows. Our team lead, Graham, had a spreadsheet open on the projector again, rows of names, columns of dates. He scrolled slowly as he spoke. "We'll need solid coverage through December and January," he said. "Traffic always spikes around the holidays." Someone asked about on-call rotations. Graham nodded. "We'll keep the current structure mostly intact." Then he added something that sounded casual. "Imogen's already comfortable with overnight maintenance, so we'll continue routing most of those windows through her." Again, the decision arrived as a statement, not a question. A few people glanced in my direction briefly, not because they expected me to object, more like a polite acknowledgement that I had been mentioned. No one seemed surprised. And in that moment, the realization settled quietly in my mind. This wasn't just a temporary arrangement anymore. Inside the team's unwritten understanding, I had become something very specific. The reliable one who could absorb the inconvenient work. Not because anyone had forced me, but because, over time, my silence had allowed that expectation to grow. It's easy to look back and imagine I should have challenged it right then. But situations like that are rarely so simple. The room was calm. The conversation moved quickly. Objecting would have required stopping the meeting, reframing the discussion, and explaining why a role everyone already believed was reasonable suddenly needed reconsideration. So I didn't interrupt. Instead, I wrote another small note in my notebook later that afternoon. Just a few words. Overnight responsibility assumed by team leadership. No direct confirmation requested. At the time, I still believed the situation was manageable. After all, maintenance windows were just part of the job. And soon, something much happier was approaching. My wedding. In a few months, Daniel and I would finally take the trip we had been postponing for years. 2 quiet weeks in Italy. No alerts, no deployments, no overnight server logs. At least, that was the plan. What I didn't know yet was that somewhere inside our scheduling system, the role everyone had quietly assigned to me was about to follow me much further than the office. Far enough that it would eventually appear on my phone while I was thousands of kilometers away. The shift didn't happen during a meeting. It didn't happen during a disagreement. And it certainly didn't happen during the honeymoon itself. The moment things quietly changed actually occurred a few weeks before Daniel and I left for Italy. It was late in the afternoon, and the office was beginning to thin out. The winter light outside the windows had already started fading, casting long reflections across the rows of desks. Most people were finishing small tasks before heading home. I was reviewing a maintenance calendar when something caught my attention. Our internal scheduling system had recently been updated. Normally, it was a simple tool, nothing more than a shared calendar where infrastructure work was tracked. But during the update, the interface now showed something it hadn't before: change history. Every adjustment to the schedule displayed a small timestamp. And beside each timestamp, the name of the person who made the change. At first, I didn't think much about it. Curiosity made me scroll back through a few recent entries. Routine edits appeared exactly as expected. Engineers adjusting their own availability. Managers are shifting windows when deployments change. Then I reached the maintenance cycle we had discussed months earlier, the one everyone assumed I was covering. I noticed something subtle. The entries attaching my name to those overnight shifts had all been added at the same time. Not gradually, not after discussions, all at once. The timestamp showed they had been inserted late one evening, long after most of the office had logged off for the day. And beside the changes was a single name: Graham. Again, none of that was technically wrong. Managers often adjusted schedules, but the pattern was unusual. Instead of assigning individual maintenance windows as they were finalized, the entire series had been attached to my name in one quiet batch. No comments, no confirmation request, no notification was sent directly to me. Just a silent update to the system. For a moment, I simply looked at the screen. Not angry, just thoughtful. Because suddenly, something about the earlier meetings made more sense. Those casual statements. Imogen's probably the best person for that. We'll route those through her. At the time, they had sounded like tentative plans. But according to the system history, the decision had already been made. The meetings had only been reinforcing it. I leaned back slightly in my chair. From the outside, nothing about the moment was dramatic. The office air conditioner hummed softly. Someone near the window was packing their laptop into a bag. But internally, something shifted. Up until that point, I had still been giving everyone the benefit of the doubt, assuming misunderstandings, assuming convenience, assuming the system would naturally correct itself. But now, I could see the structure more clearly. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was an assumption solidified into action. And assumptions, once embedded in systems, tend to persist unless someone deliberately interrupts them. I opened my notebook. The graphite pencil made a soft sound against the paper as I wrote. Maintenance schedule entered without confirmation. Timestamp logged. Change author identified. I paused for a moment. Then I added a second line. Observation only. No response yet. That last part mattered, because for the first time, my silence was no longer automatic. It had become intentional. Not passive, not resigned, just deliberate. From that afternoon onward, I started looking at things a little differently, not confronting anyone, not raising concerns in meetings, simply paying closer attention to how decisions about my time were being made. And more importantly, how they were being recorded. At the time, I still didn't know exactly why that awareness would matter. But somewhere in the back of my mind, a quiet thought had begun to form. If a system records everything, then eventually the system also tells the truth. After that afternoon, nothing about my behavior at work changed, at least not in ways anyone else could easily see. I still attended meetings. I still reviewed system alerts. I still answered messages when something unusual appeared in the infrastructure logs. From the outside, I remained exactly the same person everyone believed they understood. But internally, the nature of my silence had changed. Before, my quietness had been a kind of habit. I preferred listening to speaking, observing to reacting. It wasn't strategic. It was simply how I was wired. Now, however, silence had become something more deliberate. I had begun to treat the situation the same way I treated system anomalies, carefully, patiently, without rushing toward a conclusion before understanding the pattern. In engineering, reacting too quickly to the first symptom can sometimes make the real problem harder to see. So instead of confronting Graham immediately about the schedule changes, I did something that felt much more natural to me. I watched. Over the next few weeks, I paid closer attention to how work moved through the team, who made decisions, how those decisions were communicated, and most importantly, how they were recorded. The updated scheduling system turned out to be surprisingly informative. Each time a maintenance window was adjusted, the change history quietly logged the details. Name, timestamp, modification. Most people probably never noticed that feature, but I checked it occasionally. Not obsessively, just often enough to understand the rhythm of how things were being managed. What I discovered wasn't dramatic. Graham continued making adjustments to the maintenance calendar, usually late in the evening after the office had emptied. Sometimes he reassigned tasks between engineers. Other times, he extended coverage windows for certain systems, and consistently, almost automatically, overnight monitoring remained attached to my name. Again, nothing technically inappropriate, just consistent. Meanwhile, the office itself continued operating exactly as it always had. Oliver rushed between deadlines. Product managers scheduled planning sessions. Engineers debated deployment strategies around whiteboards filled with diagrams. Every so often, someone would stop by my desk. Hey, are you watching the overnight patch next week? Imogen probably has that covered. Let me know if the monitoring alerts spike tonight. The tone was always friendly, but beneath the friendliness, the assumption remained steady. I was the reliable one, and reliable people, in most workplaces, are expected to absorb friction quietly. The interesting thing was that nobody seemed to notice that something important was approaching. My honeymoon. Daniel and I had mentioned it casually in conversation several times. Our wedding invitations had gone out months earlier. My planned vacation dates were already entered into the company calendar. 2 full weeks, completely offline. It wasn't a secret, which made the situation slightly more curious. Because, despite that clearly marked absence, The maintenance schedule remained unchanged. My name still appeared beside several overnight windows. Some of them fell directly in the middle of those vacation dates. At first, I wondered if Graham simply hadn't noticed. Managers juggle dozens of moving pieces. Overlooking a vacation calendar isn't impossible. But then one evening, while reviewing the change history again, I noticed something small. A recent edit. A timestamp from just 2 nights earlier. The maintenance windows during my honeymoon week had been reconfirmed. Not removed. Not reassigned. Confirmed. Again, Graham's name appeared beside the change. I stared at the entry for a moment. Still calm. Still analytical. But now the pattern had become unmistakable. Someone had seen the conflict, and instead of correcting it, they had allowed it to remain. That was the moment I understood something subtle but important. My silence was still being interpreted the same way it always had been, as an agreement, as availability, as proof that whatever responsibility was quietly placed on my shoulders would simply remain there. And perhaps, up until recently, that assumption might have been correct. But now, I had a much clearer picture of the system surrounding me. And once you understand a system clearly enough, you begin to see where its pressure points are. Not to break it, just to understand what happens when its assumptions stop working. There's something interesting about being underestimated. People tend to relax around you. They assume your quietness means passivity, that your calm demeanor means you aren't paying close attention. And when people believe they aren't being closely observed, they behave very naturally, unfiltered. For someone who works in systems reliability, that environment is surprisingly informative because patterns become visible. After I noticed the confirmed maintenance windows overlapping with my honeymoon, I didn't react publicly. I didn't send messages asking for clarification. I didn't raise the issue in meetings. Instead, I did what I had always done best. I started preparing. Not in an aggressive way, nothing dramatic. Just careful attention to details that most people tend to overlook. First, I reviewed my official vacation approval. Daniel and I had submitted the request months earlier, shortly after finalizing our wedding plans. The approval was clear. 2 weeks of leave, fully documented in the HR system and mirrored in the shared company calendar. Everything was perfectly normal. Then I checked something else. The on-call policy. Every infrastructure team had one, usually buried somewhere inside internal documentation. It outlined who could assign overnight coverage, how conflicts were supposed to be handled, and what procedures were required when someone was unavailable. Our policy was simple. Maintenance assignments required direct confirmation from the engineer responsible for the shift, not assumed agreement. Confirmation. I read the section twice. Then I quietly archived a copy of the document. Again, this wasn't preparation for a confrontation. It was simply documentation. In reliability engineering, documentation is the difference between confusion and clarity when systems fail. I treated workplace structures the same way. Next, I reviewed the scheduling system's export feature. Most people use the calendar visually, glancing at upcoming tasks and moving on. But the platform also allowed a full log export. Timestamps, edits, user actions, and history. The file was surprisingly detailed. Every change Graham had made to the maintenance windows appeared in a clean chronological list. Name assignments, time adjustments, confirmation updates, including the one that reaffirmed my overnight shifts during my vacation week. I saved a local copy. Again, nothing unusual. Just another file in a folder that already contained system logs, deployment reports, and documentation from past incidents. Meanwhile, everyday life at the office continued exactly as before. People joked near the coffee machine. The engineering floor buzzed with conversations about upcoming releases. My wedding gradually became a cheerful topic around the team. "Where are you two going again?" someone asked one afternoon. "Florence," I said, smiling, "and a few smaller towns nearby." "That sounds incredible," Oliver said. "You deserve the break." I appreciated that. Most of my coworkers genuinely meant well. None of them was trying to cause problems. They simply operated inside the same assumptions that had quietly developed over time. Assumptions about who handled certain responsibilities. Assumptions about who was always available. Assumptions about who would quietly make things work. What they didn't notice was that something small had shifted in how I approached those assumptions. I was no longer simply absorbing them, I was mapping them. One evening, as I was shutting down my workstation, Graham walked past my desk. "Vacation coming up soon, right?" he asked casually. "Next month," I replied. "Nice timing," he said. "Things should be fairly stable by then." His tone was light, friendly, and for a brief moment, I wondered if perhaps he planned to adjust the schedule later. Maybe the conflict would resolve itself naturally. But when I checked the maintenance calendar again the following week, nothing had changed. My name still appeared beside the overnight windows, including the one scheduled halfway through my honeymoon. At that point, I stopped wondering whether the system would correct itself. Instead, I focused on something much more important: understanding exactly what the system recorded. Because systems, unlike human memory, don't reinterpret events later. They store them precisely as they occurred. And sometimes, that precision becomes very valuable, especially when assumptions eventually collide with reality. The interesting thing about information is that it doesn't always feel powerful at the moment you discover it. Sometimes it simply brings clarity. And clarity, when it arrives quietly, doesn't come with excitement. It comes with a calm understanding that the situation is exactly what it appears to be. The private reveal for me happened about a week before the wedding. By then, most of my preparations were finished. Daniel and I had finalized travel plans, confirmed our hotel reservations in Florence, and carefully packed the small things couples always forget until the last minute. Work, meanwhile, continued normally, at least on the surface. But one afternoon, while reviewing a routine infrastructure ticket, I noticed something connected to the maintenance schedule that made the entire situation suddenly much clearer. It was a permission setting. Our scheduling system allowed managers to assign tasks, but it also included a separate feature: confirmation flags. When someone accepted responsibility for a shift, the system could record that confirmation. The feature existed specifically to prevent misunderstandings. If an engineer confirmed a shift, their name appeared beside the confirmation field. If they hadn't confirmed it yet, the field remained empty. Curious, I opened the maintenance windows that overlapped with my honeymoon. Every single one of them had a confirmation flag, but the name attached to the confirmation wasn't mine. It was Graham's. I stared at the screen for a moment, reading the entry carefully. Confirmed by Graham Fletcher, Infrastructure Manager, which meant something very specific. The system believed the shifts had been accepted, but the acceptance had been recorded by the same person who assigned them. Technically, the system allowed that, but according to the policy I had saved earlier, confirmation was supposed to come from the engineer responsible for the shift, not the manager assigning it. It was a small detail, the kind that most people would probably overlook. But suddenly, the entire pattern made perfect sense. Graham hadn't simply assumed I would handle the maintenance windows. He had quietly formalized that assumption inside the system itself. The calendar showed my name. The confirmation field suggested agreement. Anyone checking the schedule would see a completed assignment and assume everything had been properly arranged. And because I hadn't objected earlier, nothing in the system contradicted that story. For a moment, I leaned back in my chair, still calm, still analytical, because this discovery didn't make me angry. If anything, it made the situation much simpler. Up until then, there had always been a small possibility that everything was just a misunderstanding. Now, there was documentation showing exactly how the assignments had been recorded. Not maliciously, not aggressively, just quietly. And that quietness mattered, because it mirrored the way my role had gradually formed within the team. Small decisions, small assumptions. Each one is easy to justify on its own. Together, however, they created a structure that relied entirely on one belief: that I would always be available, that I would never challenge the system, that if something inconvenient appeared beside my name on a schedule, I would simply adjust my life around it. I closed the scheduling window and opened my notebook. The pencil moved slowly across the page. Confirmation flag entered by manager, not engineer. I paused briefly. Then I added a second line. System records assignment as accepted. That was the moment when the situation fully revealed itself. Not emotionally, but structurally. Because now I could see the entire chain. The meetings where responsibility had been casually mentioned. The scheduling entries were inserted late in the evening. The confirmation flags quietly completed without my input. None of it involved shouting or confrontation. It was simply a system operating on assumptions. And systems built on assumptions usually function perfectly until reality arrives. At that point, I faced a decision. I had several options. I could message Graham immediately and request that the schedule be corrected. I could escalate the issue through HR before leaving for vacation. Or I could do something much quieter. Something that would allow the system to continue operating exactly as it believed it should, at least for a little while longer. I closed my notebook, and for the first time since noticing the schedule conflict, I made a clear decision. Not about confrontation, but about timing. When you clearly understand a situation, the hardest part is often deciding when to act. Not whether something is wrong, not whether it should be corrected, just when. During the week before my wedding, that question stayed quietly in the background of my mind. On the surface, life was filled with much happier priorities. final confirmations with family, travel documents, last-minute packing decisions. Daniel and I kept postponing because neither of us wanted to overthink them. Work, meanwhile, continued exactly as it always had. I attended the final infrastructure meeting before my leave. We reviewed deployment schedules and routine maintenance tasks. Graham presented the upcoming maintenance windows on the projector. My name still appeared beside the overnight shifts. No one mentioned the overlap with my vacation. Not Graham, not anyone else. And I said nothing. Part of me wondered if perhaps he would correct it at the last moment. Managers sometimes leave adjustments until the final schedule review. But the meeting ended. The calendar remained unchanged. That evening, I sat at my desk a little longer than usual after most of the office had left. The engineering floor was quiet. Cleaning staff moved through the hallway outside, their carts rolling softly across the floor. I opened the scheduling system again. The entries were exactly the same. My honeymoon week, overnight maintenance, confirmation flag completed. From a purely practical perspective, I had several straightforward options. I could send Graham a message. Hey, I noticed the maintenance window overlaps with my approved leave. Could you reassign it? That would likely solve the problem immediately. Or I could escalate the situation through formal channels before leaving. The documentation I had collected would make the issue very clear. But both of those options required something I had spent months observing. They required me to interrupt the system before it experienced its own consequences. And that thought made me pause. Because sometimes the most revealing moment in any structure comes when assumptions meet reality without interference. For months, the team had quietly operated under one belief: that I would always be available. That if my name appeared beside a responsibility, I would handle it. Even if no one had asked. Even if no one had confirmed. If I corrected the schedule before leaving, the assumption would simply adjust itself. The system would adapt, and the moment would disappear. But if I did nothing, then eventually, the system would encounter a very simple fact. I would be in Italy, offline, unavailable, and the maintenance window would arrive exactly as scheduled. Not because I ignored my responsibilities, but because the schedule had been created under an assumption that had never actually been confirmed. I looked again at the vacation approval in the HR system. The dates were clear, approved, documented, entered months earlier. My responsibilities had been fulfilled. Everything beyond that point belonged to the system itself. So that evening, I closed the scheduling window. I shut down my laptop. And I walked out of the office without sending a single message about the maintenance schedule. Not as a protest, not as a strategy for revenge, just as a decision to allow the structure everyone believed in to continue functioning exactly as it had been designed. Because sometimes, the clearest way to reveal a fragile assumption is simply to stop protecting it. 2 weeks later, standing beside the Arno River in Florence, I would finally see what happens when that moment arrives. But at that point, I still had a wedding to celebrate and a honeymoon waiting on the other side. The last week before my wedding passed in a blur of small details. Friends visiting from out of town, family dinners that stretched late into the evening, the quiet, slightly surreal realization that something Daniel and I had been planning for over a year was finally about to happen. Work gradually faded into the background. But before I left, there were still a few things I wanted to do, quietly, carefully, and without attracting attention. Not because I expected a problem, simply because clarity matters when systems become confused. A few days before my final day in the office, I updated my internal documentation. Every engineer in our team maintained handover notes before extended leave. It was standard practice, especially for infrastructure work where systems ran continuously. My document was thorough. I listed current monitoring dashboards, recent infrastructure changes, known areas of instability that someone might want to watch. And at the end, I included a very clear line: engineer unavailable from vacation dates. No active on call or maintenance coverage assigned during this period. It was factual, neutral, and accurate from my perspective. I saved the document in the team's shared knowledge base, exactly where handover notes were normally stored. Then I updated my out of office message. The message was simple: thank you for your message. I will be away from the office between dates and will have limited access to email. For urgent infrastructure matters, please contact the on call engineer through the standard rotation channel. Again, nothing unusual. Most people in the company used similar messages during vacations. The difference was that the message directed all urgent issues toward the on call rotation system, not toward me personally, which was precisely how our infrastructure team was supposed to operate. On my final afternoon, I packed my laptop into my bag and walked through the engineering floor one last time before leaving. Oliver waved from across the room. "Enjoy Italy," he said. "Try not to check Slack too much." "I'll do my best," I replied, with a smile. Graham was in a meeting room when I passed his office, speaking to someone over a video call. I considered briefly whether to stop and mention the schedule, but the moment passed quickly, because by then, everything that needed to be recorded had already been recorded. The vacation approval, the scheduling entries, the confirmation flags, the team handover note, all of it existed quietly in different parts of the system. Nothing hidden, nothing dramatic, just documentation. And documentation, in technical environments, has a way of becoming very important when questions eventually appear. That evening, Daniel and I finished packing the last few things for our trip. My work laptop stayed in my bag, powered down. The next morning, we left for the airport just after sunrise. The city was still waking up as our taxi moved through the quiet streets of London. For the first time in months, my phone was silent. No alerts, no late-night infrastructure warnings. Just the quiet anticipation of a trip we had both been waiting for. When our plane finally lifted above the clouds, I felt something unusual. Not relief, more like a gentle sense of distance. The office, the schedules, the small patterns I had been observing for months, they were now thousands of kilometers away. For the first few days in Italy, Daniel and I wandered through Florence without any particular plan. Stone streets, small cafes. The warm golden light seems to settle over the city in the late afternoon. Work never crossed my mind. Not until the evening, when my phone began to vibrate. At first, it was only one message, then another, then several more. And when I finally looked down at the screen, the first message read, "Imogen, are you logging in for the overnight maintenance window?" A second message appeared beneath it. Servers are waiting for confirmation. We thought you were covering tonight. And a third. This one is less patient. Why did you volunteer for the shift if you're not online? I stood there for a moment on a quiet street in Florence, watching the messages appear. Because halfway through my honeymoon, I had just discovered something very clear. The maintenance window had arrived, exactly as the system expected. The only difference was, I was standing in Italy. The first message had been polite. The second was confused. By the fourth or fifth, the tone had started to shift. I stood there on the narrow street in Florence, with Daniel a few steps ahead of me, studying a restaurant menu posted beside the door. The evening air carried that quiet warmth that only seems to appear in Italian cities after sunset. Conversations drifted out of nearby cafes. Glasses clinked softly somewhere behind us, and my phone kept vibrating. More messages. Most of them are coming from our internal team chat. At first, I didn't open the conversation. I just watched the notifications stack on the screen. Oliver. Is Imogen joining the maintenance window? DevOps channel. Patch sequence ready to deploy. Another engineer. Waiting for confirmation before restarting the cluster. Then a direct message appeared. Oliver. Hey, quick question. Are you online tonight? We thought you volunteered for this window. I read the message slowly. The wording caught my attention. Not assigned, not scheduled, volunteered. Which meant the story inside the system had traveled even further than I realized. Somewhere along the way, the assumption that I would cover the maintenance windows had evolved into a belief that I had personally agreed to them. I finally opened the team channel. The conversation had grown noticeably more urgent. Someone had posted a screenshot of the maintenance schedule. My name sat beside the overnight window, exactly where it had been for weeks. Another message appeared a few seconds later. We can't start the patch cycle without the monitoring lead. Then one more. Does anyone know why Imogen isn't responding? I took a slow breath, still calm, still standing in a quiet Italian street while the entire situation unfolded thousands of kilometers away. Daniel glanced back at me. Everything okay? He asked. Work messages, I said lightly. I'll look at them later. He nodded, already turning his attention back to the restaurant menu. That small moment reminded me of something important. I wasn't in London anymore. I wasn't in the office. And most importantly, I wasn't on call. The responsibility everyone believed I held had never actually been confirmed. For a few minutes, I simply watched the conversation continue without participating. Eventually, someone tagged Graham. At Graham, is Imogen running this maintenance window? There was a pause. Then Graham responded. Yes, she confirmed the shift weeks ago. I read that line twice. Not surprised, just noticing. Because from Graham's perspective, the system supported that belief. The schedule showed my name. The confirmation flag existed. Anyone checking the records would assume everything had been properly arranged. Except for one small detail. The person who supposedly confirmed the shift was currently standing beside the Arno River in Italy, with an out-of-office message active and a vacation request approved months earlier. Back in the chat, the situation was beginning to create visible confusion. Someone wrote, "Her Slack status says she's away, Another message followed. Wait, isn't she on her honeymoon? The channel went quiet for a moment. Then Oliver posted again. I thought that was next month. A few seconds passed, and then another message appeared, this time from someone in operations. Maintenance window is already delayed. We need a monitoring lead. For the first time, the system had encountered something it didn't know how to interpret. The schedule said I was responsible. Reality said I wasn't there. And when those two things collide, confusion spreads quickly. I slipped my phone back into my pocket, not out of frustration, just because there was nothing I needed to add yet. The situation wasn't dramatic. No one was yelling. But somewhere inside the infrastructure team, a simple question had begun to form. Why was the person scheduled for the shift unavailable? And the answer to that question already existed inside the system. It just hadn't been examined yet. About 20 minutes later, my phone vibrated again. This time, the message came directly from Graham. Imogen, where are you? We're waiting to start the maintenance window. I read it once, then glanced at the time. In London, it was just after midnight. In Florence, the sky was still glowing with late evening light. I replied calmly. Hi, Graham. I'm currently on approved leave for my honeymoon. I'm in Italy. There was a long pause before the typing indicator appeared. Then another message arrived. But you confirmed the overnight maintenance shift. I looked back at the river for a moment before answering. I didn't confirm any shifts during my leave. My vacation dates have been in the calendar for months. Another pause. Longer this time. Finally, Graham responded again. We've already delayed the maintenance window. We need someone to monitor the servers. His message carried a subtle urgency now. But the situation had already moved past the point where a quick correction would solve it. Because the system still showed my name, and the shift had already begun. I typed one final response. I am unable to access work systems while on leave. The on-call rotation should have someone available. Then I placed my phone back in my pocket. Behind me, Florence continued exactly as it had before. Restaurants filling with evening conversations, lights reflecting across the river. Somewhere far away, the team was scrambling to reorganize the maintenance window. But by then, one thing had become very clear. The assumption that had quietly carried the system for months had finally reached the moment where it could no longer hold. And by the time anyone realized it, it was already too late to fix it quickly. When I returned to the office 2 weeks later, nothing looked different. Same desks, same quiet hum of monitors, same coffee machine in the corner. But the atmosphere felt slightly tighter. Graham asked if we could talk for a moment. Inside the meeting room, he closed the door and sat across from me. The maintenance window caused a lot of disruption, he said. We were under the impression you had confirmed that shift. I nodded calmly. My vacation was approved months earlier, I replied, and I never confirmed any overnight maintenance during that time. He didn't argue. For a few seconds, he simply looked at the scheduling records on his laptop. Everything was there. The assignments, the confirmation entry, the vacation approval. Finally, he exhaled quietly. I see. No raised voices, no accusations. Just the quiet recognition of how the assumption had formed and how easily it had collapsed. After that conversation, Something subtle changed at work. Not dramatically, just quietly. Schedules began including confirmation requests again. Overnight maintenance was rotated more carefully through the team. Decisions that once arrived as assumptions started appearing as questions. Are you available for this window? Does this time work for you? No one said it directly, but the system had adjusted. As for me, I didn't become louder or more confrontational. I was still the same person, observant, calm, and careful with my words. The difference was simpler than that. People now understood something they hadn't fully seen before. Reliability doesn't mean endless availability. And quiet people notice far more than others assume. That understanding changed the way others approached me. But more importantly, it changed how I approached my own role. I was still dependable, just no longer invisible. Looking back, nothing in this story involved revenge. No dramatic confrontation, no public embarrassment, just a simple moment where a system built on assumptions finally met reality. For a long time, people believed my silence meant agreement. If responsibility quietly appeared beside my name, I would always absorb it. But silence doesn't always mean consent. Sometimes it simply means someone is watching carefully, waiting for the right moment for the truth to become visible on its own. In the end, nothing collapsed. The servers kept running, the team adjusted, and the workplace became just a little more careful about how decisions were made. For me, the lesson was simple. Being dependable is valuable. But being dependable should never mean being invisible. And sometimes, the calmest response, the one without anger or noise, is the one that changes a system the most. So I'm curious about something. Have you ever had a moment where people assumed you would always say yes until one day you simply didn't?